Millionaire, who didn't believe in miracles, sees a girl begging for food, and she says, "In exchange for your leftovers, I can make you walk again." Don't forget to like this video if this story is touching your heart. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something that challenged everything you believed? Your stories inspire us all. Richard Blackstone's wheelchair clicked against the marble floor of his penthouse as he positioned himself before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. 15 years. 15 goddamn years since the accident that took everything from him. His legs, his marriage, his faith in anything resembling hope or divine intervention. At 62, he had built an empire worth $3 billion. But what good was money when you couldn't feel your legs beneath you? The irony wasn't lost on him. He could buy anything in the world except the one thing he wanted most, the ability to stand on his own 2 feet. "Mr. Blackstone, your dinner reservation at Le Bernardin is confirmed for 8 o'clock. His assistant Margaret's voice crackled through the intercom. She had been with him for 23 years, since before the accident, and was one of the few people who didn't treat him like broken china. "Cancel it," Richard muttered, not turning from the window. "I'm not in the mood for their pretentious bullshit tonight." The city lights twinkled below like fallen stars, mocking him with their beauty. He remembered when he used to walk these streets, when he could climb stairs without thinking, when he could dance with his wife Sarah at charity galas. Sarah. The name still cut through him like a blade. She had tried to stay, God bless her, but watching the man she married become a bitter, rage-filled stranger proved too much. The divorce papers arrived 3 years after the accident, along with a note that simply said, "I'm sorry, Richard. I loved who you were." His reflection stared back at him from the window, steel grey hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to hide the fact that his legs were nothing more than dead weight, and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. People called him ruthless in business, and they weren't wrong. When you've lost everything that matters, stepping on others to reach the top becomes remarkably easy. The intercom buzzed again. "Sir, your driver is here." "Where the hell am I supposed to be going, Margaret?" "You have dinner at Romano's. You specifically requested it this morning after your therapy session with Dr. Williams." Richard's jaw tightened. Dr. Williams, his physical therapist, had been pushing him to get out more, to stop isolating himself in his tower of glass and steel. "Fine. Tell Peterson I'll be down in 10 minutes. The elevator ride to the parking garage was silent, except for the mechanical hum of machinery. Peterson, his driver for the past 8 years, helped him into the back seat of the Bentley without a word. They both knew the routine by now. Richard's dignity was fragile enough, without unnecessary conversation about his limitations. Romano's sat in Little Italy, a family-owned restaurant that had somehow survived the gentrification of downtown Manhattan. Richard had been coming here since his college days, back when he still believed in dreams and possibilities. The owner, Giuseppe Romano, treated him the same as always, like a valued customer, not a charity case. "Mr. Richard!" Giuseppe beamed as Peterson wheeled him through the entrance. "Your usual table is ready. Angela made fresh ossobuco tonight, just like you love." The familiar warmth of the restaurant embraced him, and for the first time all day, Richard felt something close to peace. He ordered his meal and a bottle of Barolo, determined to push away the darkness that seemed to follow him everywhere these days. An hour later, fortified by wine and Giuseppe's excellent cooking, Richard felt ready to face his empty penthouse again. Peterson helped him back into the Bentley, and they began the journey uptown. As they stopped at a red light near Columbus Circle, Richard noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A small figure approached the passenger side of the car, and Richard's first instinct was to tell Peterson to drive through the red light. New York was full of panhandlers, and he'd learned long ago that charity was just another word for enabling. But something made him look closer. The figure was a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with tangled dark hair and clothes that had seen too many winters. She wasn't aggressive like most street people. Instead, she stood quietly beside the car, her small hands pressed against the window. In the glow of the streetlight, Richard could see her face clearly. She wasn't strung out or mentally ill like so many of the homeless he encountered. Her eyes were bright, intelligent, and somehow familiar. Against his better judgment, Richard pressed the button to lower the window a few inches. The December air rushed in, carrying the scent of snow and exhaust fumes. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. The girl didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I'm not asking for money, mister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't eaten in 2 days. If you have any food left from dinner, I'd be grateful for whatever you don't want." Richard glanced at the takeout container on the seat beside him. Giuseppe had insisted he take home the leftover ossobuco, claiming it would be even better tomorrow. He looked back at the girl, trying to understand why she seemed so different from every other panhandler in the city. "You're just a kid," he said. "Where are your parents?" Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or loss. "Gone," she said simply. "It's just me now." The light turned green, and Peterson began to ease forward, but Richard held up his hand. "Wait," he said, then looked back at the girl. "What's your name?" "Emily," she replied. "Emily Grace." Richard stared at her for a long moment. There was something about her that defied explanation, a quality he couldn't quite name. Despite his cynicism, despite 15 years of disappointment and bitterness, he found himself reaching for the takeout container. "Here," he said, passing it through the window. "There's enough for 2 meals if you're careful with it." Emily's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire street corner. She clutched the container carefully, as if it were made of gold instead of cardboard. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." As Peterson began to drive away, Emily called out, "Wait!" Richard looked back, expecting her to ask for money after all. Instead, she stepped closer to the car, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I can see your pain," she said, her voice carrying despite the traffic noise around them. "The chair, the emptiness inside. What if I told you I could take it all away?" Richard felt his heart skip. "What are you talking about?" Emily's smile was gentle, almost ethereal. "In exchange for your kindness tonight, I can give you something precious. I can make you walk again." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't think. Then anger flooded through him, white-hot rage at this child for daring to mock his deepest pain. "Drive," he snapped at Peterson. "Drive now." But as the Bentley pulled away from the curb, Richard couldn't stop himself from looking back. Emily stood under the streetlight, still clutching his food, still smiling that impossible smile. And just before they turned the corner, he could have sworn he saw something that defied explanation, a faint golden glow surrounding the strange little girl who claimed she could perform miracles. Richard didn't sleep that night. He lay in his custom hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the encounter with Emily Grace over and over in his mind. The rational part of him knew it was nonsense, just a desperate child saying whatever she thought might earn her a few more dollars. But something about her voice, her eyes, the way she seemed to see straight through him, made it impossible to dismiss completely. By dawn, he had convinced himself it was the wine talking. Too much Barolo and not enough common sense. He'd built his fortune on logic and cold calculation, not fairy tales and false hope. Miracles were for people who couldn't accept reality, and Richard Blackstone had made peace with his limitations long ago. Or so he told himself. His morning routine was rigid and unchanging: physical therapy at 6, shower with the help of his aide Marcus, breakfast while reviewing financial reports, then off to his office on Wall Street where he could focus on things that actually mattered. Numbers didn't lie. Profit margins were predictable. Unlike life, business followed rules that made sense. "You seem distracted today, Mr. Blackstone," Dr. Williams observed as Richard struggled through his rehabilitation exercises. The physical therapist had been working with him for 5 years, and Richard grudgingly respected the man's refusal to coddle him. "I'm fine," Richard grunted, pushing himself through another set of arm exercises. "Just thinking about the Morrison acquisition." Dr. Williams raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He knew better than to push Richard on personal matters. "Your upper body strength is improving nicely. Have you given any more thought to that new experimental treatment I mentioned, the stem cell therapy in Switzerland?" Richard had heard about the treatment, of course. He'd investigated every possible option in the 15 years since his accident. Experimental surgeries, cutting-edge therapies, treatments that existed only in research papers. He'd spent millions chasing dead ends and false promises. "It's not for me," he said flatly. "I'm not interested in being some researcher's lab rat." "The preliminary results are very encouraging." "No." Richard's voice carried the finality that had closed $1,000 deals and ended careers. "I've wasted enough time and money on maybes." But even as he spoke the words, Emily's voice echoed in his memory. "I can make you walk again." The drive to his office took 40 minutes through Manhattan traffic, and Richard spent every minute trying to push thoughts of the strange girl from his mind. He had a company to run, shareholders to satisfy, competitors to crush. There was no room in his life for fantasies about miraculous cures from homeless children. His office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, with views of the Hudson River and enough space to house a small army. Richard had designed it himself after the accident. Everything at wheelchair height, wide corridors, bathrooms equipped with every conceivable accommodation. It was his kingdom, his sanctuary, the one place where his disability didn't matter because everything had been built around it. Margaret was waiting for him with his schedule and a cup of coffee prepared exactly as he liked it. Black, no sugar, hot enough to burn. She had been his assistant since before his marriage, before the accident, before everything went to hell. At 58, she was probably the closest thing he had to a friend, though neither of them would ever admit it. "The Henderson proposal is on your desk," she said, falling into step beside his chair as they moved toward his office. "Legal wants your signature on the Collins contract by noon. And your sister called." Richard's jaw tightened. "What did Patricia want?" "She didn't say, just asked you to call her back when you have time." Patricia, his younger sister, the golden child who had married well and produced 2 perfect grandchildren for their parents before they died. She called once a month with the same routine, updates about her family, careful inquiries about his health, awkward invitations to holidays he never attended. She meant well, but her pity was harder to bear than outright cruelty. "Tell her I'm in meetings all day," Richard said. "I'll call her tomorrow." He spent the morning reviewing acquisition targets and barking orders at subordinates who jumped to attention when he entered a room. This was his element, the ruthless world of corporate warfare, where weakness was blood in the water and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Here his chair was irrelevant. Here he was still the apex predator he'd always been. But lunch brought unexpected complications. "Mr. Blackstone?" Margaret's voice came through the intercom as he reviewed quarterly projections. "There's a delivery for you at reception. I'm not expecting anything. Have them leave it with security." "Sir, the delivery person insists it's personal. She says she needs to speak with you directly." Richard looked up from his papers, a chill running down his spine. "She?" "A young girl, sir. Maybe 10 or 11 years old. She's asking for you by name." The financial report slipped from Richard's hands, scattering across his desk. It couldn't be the same girl. It was impossible. He lived in a secured building with multiple layers of security, background checks for anyone who wanted access to the upper floors. How could a homeless child get past all of that? "Send her up," he heard himself saying. "Sir, I don't think—" "Send her up, Margaret, now." 5 minutes later, his office door opened and Emily Grace walked in as if she owned the place. She looked exactly as she had the night before, tangled hair, worn clothes, too thin frame of a child who knew hunger intimately. But she walked with a confidence that seemed impossible given her circumstances, and her eyes held the same strange intelligence that had unsettled him in the car. "Hello again, Mr. Blackstone," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, as if they were old friends. "Thank you for the food last night. It was delicious." Richard stared at her, his mind racing. "How did you get up here? This building has security." "I told them I had a delivery for you," Emily said with a small shrug. "People see what they expect to see. A girl with a package must be from a delivery service, right? That's impossible. They would have checked your credentials, asked for identification." Emily's smile was patient, almost pitying. "Mr. Blackstone, you've spent 15 years learning about limitations. Maybe it's time you learned about possibilities." Richard felt his hands tremble slightly, and he gripped the arms of his wheelchair to steady himself. "What do you want from me?" "I want to keep my promise," Emily said simply. "Last night you showed me kindness when you didn't have to. You fed someone who was hungry without asking for anything in return. That matters more than you know." "It was just leftover food." "It was compassion," Emily interrupted. "And compassion is the rarest gift of all, especially from someone who has suffered as much as you have." Richard's throat felt tight. "You don't know anything about my suffering." "Don't I?" Emily leaned forward, her dark eyes seeming to look directly into his soul. October 15th, 2008. You were driving home from the hospital after visiting your father, who was dying of cancer. It was raining and the other driver ran a red light. Your car rolled 3 times before hitting the guardrail. When you woke up 3 days later, the doctors told you your father was dead and you would never walk again. The color drained from Richard's face. Those details had never been made public, never appeared in any newspaper or magazine article about his accident. Only a handful of people knew the full story, and none of them would have shared it with a homeless child. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Emily's expression was infinitely gentle. "I know many things, Richard. I know you blame yourself for not being at your father's bedside when he died. I know you pushed away everyone who tried to help you because you couldn't bear their pity. I know you lie awake at night, wondering if God exists, and if he does, why he let you survive when your father didn't." Tears burned Richard's eyes, the first tears he had shed in over a decade. "Stop," he said hoarsely. "Please stop." "I know you've forgotten what it feels like to hope," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here to remind you. I'm here to show you that miracles aren't just stories people tell to make themselves feel better. They're real, Richard, and you deserve one." Richard couldn't speak. The rational part of his mind was screaming that this was impossible, that he was having some kind of breakdown. That stress and isolation had finally driven him over the edge. But another part of him, a part he thought had died in that hospital room 15 years ago, was beginning to believe. "What would you need me to do?" he asked, the words coming out in a rush before he could stop them. Emily's smile was radiant. "Meet me tonight, midnight, the place where it all began." "Where what began?" "Your journey back to yourself," Emily said, standing up from her chair. "Columbus Circle, where we met last night. Come alone." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Richard? Don't eat anything for the rest of the day. Where we're going, you'll need to be as light as possible." Before Richard could ask what she meant, Emily was gone, slipping out of his office as quietly as she had entered. He sat staring at the closed door for a long time, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Blackstone, is everything all right? I thought I saw someone leave your office, but I never saw anyone come in after the delivery girl." Richard closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. "Everything's fine, Margaret. Hold my calls for the rest of the afternoon." But everything was not fine. Richard Blackstone, the man who had built an empire on logic and refused to believe in anything he couldn't quantify, was beginning to hope. And hope, he had learned long ago, was the most dangerous thing of all. Richard spent the remainder of the afternoon in a state of barely controlled anxiety, second-guessing his decision to meet Emily while simultaneously counting the hours until midnight. He cancelled his evening appointments, sent Margaret home early, and sat alone in his office watching the sun set over Manhattan. By 11:30, he couldn't stand the waiting any longer. He called Peterson and told him to bring the car around, offering no explanation for the late-night excursion. The drive to Columbus Circle took 20 minutes through surprisingly light traffic, and Richard found himself holding his breath as they approached the intersection where his life had taken such an unexpected turn. Emily was waiting for him under the same streetlight where they had first met, but something was different about her appearance. The tangled hair was now clean and brushed, hanging in soft waves around her shoulders. Her worn clothes had been replaced by a simple white dress that seemed to glow in the lamplight. She looked less like a street child, and more like— Richard couldn't quite find the words for it. "You came," she said as Peterson helped him from the car. Her voice carried a warmth that seemed to chase away the December cold. "I'm here," Richard replied, though he still couldn't quite believe it himself. Now what? Emily glanced at Peterson, who was standing beside the Bentley with professional disinterest. "We need privacy for this. Ask your driver to wait for you somewhere else." Richard hesitated. Peterson had been with him for 8 years and had never once questioned his decisions or violated his trust. But something about Emily's tone suggested this wasn't a request. "Peterson, go get some coffee," Richard said finally. "Come back in an hour." The driver nodded and climbed back into the Bentley, disappearing into the night traffic. Richard was alone with Emily on a nearly deserted street corner, feeling more vulnerable than he had in years. "What happens now?" he asked. Emily moved closer to his wheelchair, her movements graceful and purposeful. "Now you have to decide how much you really want this, how much you're willing to believe. I've spent 15 years learning not to believe in anything I can't see or touch or prove," Richard said. "You're asking me to throw all of that away based on the word of a child I met 24 hours ago." "I'm asking you to remember who you were before the accident," Emily replied. "Before the cynicism and the isolation and the walls you built around your heart. Deep down, Richard, you still believe in magic. You've just forgotten how to let yourself feel it." She placed her small hand on his shoulder, and Richard felt a warmth spread through his body that had nothing to do with physical temperature. It was like sunlight after endless winter, like the first breath after nearly drowning. "Close your eyes," Emily whispered. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give you back what was taken from you. But you have to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Richard looked into her dark eyes and saw something that made his breath catch. Infinite compassion, ancient wisdom, and a love so pure it brought tears to his eyes. Against every rational instinct he possessed, he nodded. "Yes," he whispered, "I trust you." Richard closed his eyes and immediately felt the world shift around him. The sounds of the city, traffic sirens, the distant hum of 8 million people living their lives, faded into silence. The December cold disappeared, replaced by a warmth that seemed to emanate from Emily's touch. "Richard," her voice came from somewhere that seemed both very close and infinitely far away, "I need you to remember something for me. Can you remember the last time you walked?" Images flooded his mind with startling clarity. He was 47 years old, walking through the corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital after visiting his father. His legs were strong and sure beneath him, carrying him toward the elevator without conscious thought. He could feel the smooth marble beneath his leather shoes, could remember the slight ache in his calves from standing beside his father's bed for 3 hours. "I remember," he whispered. "Good. Now I want you to imagine those same legs, those same muscles, but stronger than they ever were before. Can you feel that?" And somehow, impossibly, he could. Richard felt a tingling sensation beginning in his lower back and spreading downward, like electricity following the pathways of his nervous system. It was the strangest sensation he had experienced since the accident. Not quite pain, not quite pleasure, but something entirely new. "Emily," he gasped, "what's happening to me?" "Shh," she soothed. "Don't fight it. Let it happen." The tingling intensified, and Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, sensation in his legs. It started as a distant buzz, like a limb waking up after falling asleep, but gradually grew stronger and more defined. He could feel the fabric of his pants against his skin, could sense the position of his feet in his shoes. "Oh my God," he breathed. I can actually feel." "Open your eyes, Richard." Richard's eyes snapped open, and he looked down at his legs with wonder. They looked the same as they had that morning, thin from years of disuse, covered by the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored pants. But something fundamental had changed. He could feel them, could sense the weight of them, could even— "Try to move your toes," Emily said softly. Richard focused all of his attention on his feet, and after a moment of intense concentration, he felt his big toe twitch inside his left shoe, then his right. Then all 10 toes were wiggling with a freedom he had forgotten was possible. "This is impossible," he whispered. But even as he said it, he was trying to lift his leg. His right knee rose an inch off the wheelchair's footrest, then 2 inches, then 6. The muscles in his thigh burned with the effort, but it was a good burn, a burn that meant life and strength and possibility. "Nothing is impossible," Emily said, stepping back to give him room. Now comes the hard part. I want you to stand up. Richard's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly, his knuckles went white. For 15 years, standing had been a dream, a phantom memory from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The thought of actually doing it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. What if I fall? What if you don't? Richard took a deep breath and pushed himself up from the chair. His legs shook violently with the effort, his muscles screaming in protest after years of dormancy. But they held. He was standing. Actually standing on his own 2 feet under his own power for the first time since October 15th, 2008. Emily, he gasped, tears streaming down his face. Emily, I'm standing. But when he looked around, Emily was gone. Richard stood alone under the streetlight, his legs trembling but solid beneath him, his mind reeling with the impossibility of what had just happened. He took a tentative step forward, then another, his gait unsteady but functional. Each movement sent waves of sensation through his body. The feeling of his heels striking the pavement, the shift of his weight from one foot to the other, the simple miracle of forward motion under his own power. In the distance, he could see Peterson's headlights approaching. His driver would find him standing beside an empty wheelchair, and Richard would have to find a way to explain the unexplainable. But for now, in this perfect moment between impossible and inevitable, Richard Blackstone walked slowly around the streetlight where a mysterious child had given him back his life. And as he walked, he noticed something glinting on the ground where Emily had been standing. Richard bent down, actually bent down using muscles he had forgotten he possessed, and picked up a small silver locket. Inside was a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of himself and his wife Sarah, taken on their honeymoon in Tuscany 22 years ago. But that wasn't what made his hands shake as he stared at the image. It was the inscription on the back of the locket, written in his own handwriting. For my darling Emily Grace Blackstone, may you always know how much Daddy loves you. Emily Grace. Not just Emily Grace, the mysterious child who had given him back his legs. Emily Grace Blackstone. The daughter he and Sarah had lost to miscarriage in the 3rd month of pregnancy, 7 years before his accident. The daughter they had named but never met, never held, never had the chance to love. Richard's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees on the cold pavement, clutching the locket to his chest as the truth crashed over him like a tsunami. The little girl who had approached his car last night, who had somehow made it past his building's security, who had just performed an impossible miracle in the middle of Manhattan. She wasn't just any homeless child. She was his daughter, the daughter who had never been born, somehow grown into the child she would have been. And she had saved him, given him back his life, asked for nothing in return except the kindness he should have shown her mother all those years ago. Peterson's footsteps approached behind him, and Richard could hear his driver's sharp intake of breath as he took in the scene. His employer kneeling on the sidewalk beside an empty wheelchair, sobbing like a broken man while clutching something precious to his chest. "Mr. Blackstone," Peterson said carefully. "Sir, are you all right?" Richard looked up at the man who had served him faithfully for 8 years, and for the first time in their relationship, he smiled, really smiled, with genuine joy and wonder and gratitude. "Peterson," he said, climbing slowly to his feet, "I think I'm going to walk home tonight." Richard walked through his penthouse at 3 in the morning, his bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. Each step was a revelation, each movement a reminder that the impossible had become reality. His legs, weak from 15 years of disuse, burned with the effort of supporting his weight. But he welcomed the pain. It meant he was alive in ways he had forgotten were possible. The locket lay open on his desk, the photograph of him and Sarah staring up at him like an accusation. He had looked at it 100 times since returning home, and each glance brought new waves of confusion and wonder. How was it possible? How could their lost daughter have grown into the child who had saved him? Peterson had helped him into the penthouse without asking questions, though Richard had seen the concern in the older man's eyes. For 8 years, Peterson had pushed his wheelchair, helped him in and out of cars, treated his limitations as simply another part of the job. Now Richard had walked to the elevator under his own power, and neither of them knew how to process the change. "Margaret," Richard said into his phone, not caring that it was the middle of the night. "I need you to do something for me." His assistant's voice was thick with sleep, but alert. After 23 years, she was used to his irregular hours and impossible demands. "What do you need, Mr. Blackstone?" "I want you to find everything you can about Emily Grace Blackstone, hospital records, birth certificates, death certificates, anything that exists. I need it by morning." There was a pause. "Sir, Emily Grace was. She was the baby you and Sarah lost. In 2001. What records would there be?" Richard closed his eyes, the memory still sharp after all these years. Sarah had been so excited about the pregnancy, had already started decorating the nursery and choosing names. When they lost the baby at 12 weeks, something broke inside both of them that never quite healed. It was one of the first cracks in their marriage, a wound that festered until the accident finally tore them apart completely. "Just find whatever you can," he said. "Medical records from the pregnancy, the miscarriage, anything. And Margaret, this stays between us." "Of course, sir, but Richard, are you all right?" The question stopped him cold. When was the last time Margaret had used his first name? When was the last time anyone had asked if he was all right and actually seemed to care about the answer? "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think I might be better than I've been in 15 years. After hanging up, Richard made his way to the guest bedroom that Sarah had planned to convert into a nursery. He hadn't been in this room since before the accident. It was on the second floor of his penthouse, accessible only by stairs that had been useless to him for so long. Now he climbed those stairs slowly, his legs shaking with effort, his hand gripping the banister for support. The room was exactly as Sarah had left it, preserved like a shrine to dreams that had never materialized. Pale yellow walls because they hadn't wanted to know the baby's gender. A rocking chair by the window where Sarah had planned to nurse their daughter. A crib that had never held a child. Richard sank into the rocking chair and pulled out his phone. Sarah's number was still in his contacts, though they hadn't spoken in over 5 years. She had remarried a kind man named David, had the children she had always wanted. The last he'd heard, she was living in Connecticut with her new family, trying to forget the bitter man she had once loved. His finger hovered over her number for a long time before he found the courage to press call. "Richard?" Sarah's voice was cautious, concerned. "It's 4 in the morning. What's wrong?" "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Have you ever seen Emily?" The silence stretched so long that Richard wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What did you say?" "Emily Grace, our daughter. Have you ever seen her?" "Richard, Emily Grace died before she was born. You know that. We buried the possibility of her in that cemetery in Westchester. What are you talking about?" But there was something in Sarah's tone that didn't match her words. A tremor, a hesitation that spoke of secrets kept and truths hidden. "Sarah, please. I know how this sounds, but I met a little girl tonight. She knew things about me that no one else knows. And she had this." Richard described the locket, the photograph, the inscription in his own handwriting. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "You wrote that inscription 22 years ago," she whispered. "I remember watching you engrave it at the jewelry store. We were going to give it to her on her 16th birthday. Then you know this isn't something I could have imagined." Another long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was shaking. "Richard, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago." Richard's heart began to race. "What?" "The night Emily Grace died, the night I miscarried, I had the strangest dream. I was in a beautiful garden, and there was a little girl there. She looked exactly like I imagined our daughter would look. She told me she couldn't stay, that it wasn't her time yet, but that someday she would find a way to help us, to help you." Richard felt the world tilt around him. "You never told me about this dream. How could I? You were grieving too, and I thought it was just my mind trying to make sense of the loss." "But Richard, I've had that same dream every year on the anniversary of her death. The little girl gets older each time, and she always tells me the same thing, that she's waiting for the right moment to come home. The rocking chair creaked as Richard leaned forward, his mind racing. What else does she say in these dreams? She says that love doesn't die even when life does. She says that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is letting them save us. Sarah's voice broke. Richard, I think our daughter found a way to come back to you. Richard closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Sarah was telling him. Their lost child, somehow given form and substance, had walked into his life and performed a miracle. But why now? Why after 15 years of suffering and isolation? There's something else, Sarah continued. In last night's dream, the one I had just hours before you called, Emily looked different. Older, but also fading, I guess. Like she was becoming transparent. She told me her job was almost finished, that she would finally be able to rest. A chill ran down Richard's spine. What did she mean? I don't know. But Richard, I think you need to find her. I think there's more to this story than either of us understands. After hanging up with Sarah, Richard spent the rest of the night researching everything he could about unexplained phenomena, miraculous healings, and supernatural encounters. He found hundreds of stories similar to his own, people visited by deceased loved ones, impossible recoveries, encounters with beings who seemed to exist between worlds. But none of them had answers. None of them explained how his daughter could have grown into the child she never got to be, or why she had chosen this moment to reveal herself to him. As dawn broke over Manhattan, Margaret arrived with a thick folder of documents. Medical records, hospital files, even the certificate of fetal death that had been required after the miscarriage. But tucked in between the official papers was something that made Richard's blood run cold. It was a birth certificate dated October 15, 2001, exactly 7 years to the day before his accident. The child's name was listed as Emily Grace Blackstone, parents Richard and Sarah Blackstone. According to the document, she had been born at Mount Sinai Hospital at 11:47 p.m. and died at 11:52 p.m., a 5-minute lifespan that defied everything Richard knew about their lost pregnancy. Where did you find this? He asked Margaret, his hands shaking as he held the impossible document. It was in your personal files, Margaret replied, but her expression was troubled. Sir, I've been managing your documents for over 20 years. I've never seen this certificate before. It's like it just appeared. Richard stared at the birth certificate, his mind reeling. According to this document, Emily Grace had lived for 5 minutes on the exact date that would later mark the worst day of his life. She had been born and died on October 15, 2001. He had been paralyzed on October 15, 2008, 7 years exactly. The coincidence was too perfect, too precise to be random. Somehow their daughter's brief existence was connected to his accident, to his suffering, to the miracle that had restored his ability to walk. But what kind of cosmic justice allowed a child, who had never truly lived, to spend her impossible existence saving the father who had failed to protect her? Richard's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Pier 17, South Street Seaport, tonight at midnight. We need to talk. E. His hands trembled as he stared at the message. Emily wanted to meet again, and somehow Richard knew this would be their last conversation. Whatever force had allowed their daughter to return to him was reaching its limit, and he was running out of time to understand why she had sacrificed her eternal rest to give him back his legs. As he prepared for what might be his final encounter with the impossible, Richard made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He was going to walk to meet his daughter, walk under his own power through the streets of Manhattan, feeling every step that her love had made possible. But first he had one more call to make. Sarah, he said when she answered, I need you to come to New York tonight. I think Emily is ready to say goodbye, and I don't think I can face that alone. Sarah arrived at Richard's penthouse at 10 p.m., and the moment she walked through the door, 15 years seemed to melt away. She was 57 now, her auburn hair touched with silver, laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of happiness found after heartbreak. But when she looked at Richard standing in his entryway, actually standing, not seated in the wheelchair she had learned to navigate around, Her expression was the same mixture of wonder and love he remembered from their early years together. "My God," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth, "you're really walking." "Thanks to our daughter," Richard said, and somehow it felt natural to claim Emily, even though she had never drawn breath in the conventional sense. "Sarah, there's so much I need to tell you." They sat together on the sofa, both of them sitting side by side like they used to do before everything went wrong. And Richard told her everything. The encounter at Columbus Circle, Emily's visit to his office, the impossible healing, and the locket that had shattered his understanding of reality. Sarah listened without interruption, tears streaming down her face as Richard described their daughter's kindness, her wisdom, her apparent age that somehow matched the years she would have lived if she had survived. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time. "She chose you," Sarah said finally. "Sarah. Out of all the people in the world who are suffering, who need healing, she chose to save her father. But why now? Why after 15 years? Sarah smiled through her tears. "Because 15 years ago you weren't ready to be saved. You were too angry, too proud, too determined to punish yourself for surviving when others didn't. Emily had to wait until you were broken enough to accept a gift without questioning whether you deserved it." They walked together through the December streets toward South Street Seaport, Richard's steps slow but determined. Sarah stayed close beside him, ready to catch him if he stumbled, marveling at the miracle of her former husband's restoration. The night air was crisp and clean, and despite the weight of approaching goodbye, Richard felt more alive than he had in decades. Pier 17 was nearly deserted at midnight, the tourist crowds and street performers long gone. The East River lapped against the wooden planks, and the lights of Brooklyn twinkled across the water like fallen stars. Richard and Sarah found Emily sitting on a bench at the very end of the pier, her legs swinging freely as she gazed out at the water. She turned when she heard their footsteps, and Richard's breath caught. Emily looked different tonight, more translucent, as if she were slowly becoming part of the moonlight that illuminated her face. But her smile was as warm as ever, and when she saw Sarah, her eyes lit up with recognition and joy. "Hello, Mama," Emily said, her voice carrying on the night breeze like music. Sarah collapsed to her knees beside the bench, her hands reaching out to touch the daughter she had never been able to hold. Emily's form was solid enough to embrace, warm enough to feel real, but there was an otherworldly quality to her that spoke of borrowed time and impossible grace. "My baby," Sarah sobbed, pulling Emily into her arms. "My sweet baby girl." "I'm not a baby anymore, Mama," Emily said gently. "I've been watching over you both for so long, waiting for the right time." Richard sat heavily on the bench beside them, his legs finally giving in to exhaustion. "Emily, I don't understand any of this. How are you here? Why are you here?" Emily disentangled herself from Sarah's embrace and looked at both of her parents with ancient eyes in a child's face. "When I died," she said simply, "I was given a choice. I could go on to whatever comes next, or I could stay and watch over the people I loved. I chose to stay." "For 22 years?" Richard asked. "You've been here all this time." "Time works differently for people like me," Emily explained. 22 years or 22 minutes. It's all the same when you're waiting for the right moment to act. I watched you both grieve for me, watched your marriage fall apart, watched Daddy's accident and everything that came after. I wanted to help so many times, but I couldn't interfere until you were ready to accept help." Sarah reached out to stroke Emily's hair, her fingers trembling. "The dreams I had, you were really visiting me." "Dreams are the easiest way to reach people," Emily nodded. "The barriers are thinner when you're sleeping. I tried to comfort you when I could, to let you know that death isn't the end of love." Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. "What you did for me tonight, making me walk again, that wasn't just a gift, was it? There's a price." Emily's smile was infinitely sad. "Everything has a price, Daddy, even miracles." "What's the price?" Sarah asked, though from her expression Richard thought she already knew. "My time here is borrowed," Emily said. "I was never supposed to exist in this form, never supposed to grow up or have conversations or touch the people I love. Every moment I've spent with you has been stolen from the natural order of things." Richard's throat closed up. "And healing me. Used up the last of my borrowed time," Emily finished. "I can't stay much longer. Maybe until dawn, maybe less. The universe is calling me home." Sarah let out a broken sob, but Emily took her face in her small hands. "Don't cry, Mama, this is what I wanted. I got to meet you both, got to talk with you, got to give Daddy his legs back. I got to be your daughter, even if only for a little while." Richard struggled to find words through his grief. "I would trade walking for more time with you. I would go back to that chair in a heartbeat if it meant you could stay." "I know you would," Emily said, tears flowing down her translucent cheeks. "That's how I know the healing worked. Not just your legs, Daddy, your heart. The man who gave me leftover food 2 nights ago wouldn't have said that. But the man sitting here now would sacrifice anything for love." The three of them sat together on the pier, a family that had never existed, trying to make peace with another separation. Emily told them stories of her vigil, how she had been present at Sarah's wedding to David, had watched over Richard during his darkest moments after the accident, had celebrated silently when Sarah's other children were born. "You have a little brother and sister now," Sarah told Emily. "David's children, but they would love you if they could meet you." "I know," Emily smiled. "I've watched them grow up too. Jessie is going to be a doctor, and little Michael wants to be a teacher. They're good kids, Mama. You did well." As they talked, Emily continued to become more transparent, her form wavering like a reflection on disturbed water. Richard could see the lights of Brooklyn through her body now, and he knew their time was almost up. "Is there anything we can do for you?" he asked desperately. "Anything you need before you go?" Emily considered this for a moment. "There is one thing. I want you both to forgive yourselves. Mama, you've spent 22 years blaming yourself for losing me, thinking you weren't strong enough to carry me to term. Daddy, you've spent 15 years punishing yourself for surviving the accident when others didn't. None of that was your fault, and holding on to guilt won't honor my memory." She stood up from the bench, her form now so translucent that the moonlight passed through her like she was made of mist. "I want you to live, really live. Use the gift I've given you, Daddy. Walk to places you've never been, dance if the music moves you, run if you feel like running. And Mama, I want you to tell Jessie and Michael about me someday. Not the sad story of the baby who died, but the story of the daughter who found a way to come back and save her father." Richard rose unsteadily to his feet, his legs shaking with emotion rather than weakness. "Emily, I love you. I've loved you since the moment we knew you existed, and I'll love you until the day I die. I love you too, Daddy, and I'm so proud of who you're going to become." Sarah stood and embraced Emily one last time, holding their daughter as tightly as she could while Emily's form continued to fade. "Will we see you again? When our time comes?" Emily's smile was radiant, even as she became nothing more than starlight and hope. "When you're ready to join me, I'll be waiting. And we'll have forever to be the family we never got to be on Earth." As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, Emily Grace Blackstone faded completely from sight, leaving only the locket on the bench where she had been sitting. Richard and Sarah stood together at the end of the pier, holding each other as they grieved their daughter for the second time in their lives. But this grief was different from the first. This was the clean pain of letting go, of saying goodbye to someone you had truly known and loved. Emily hadn't just given Richard his legs back, she had given them both the chance to be parents, even if only for 3 impossible days. As they walked home together through the empty streets of Manhattan, Richard's steps growing stronger with each block, he realized that his daughter's greatest gift hadn't been the miracle of healing. It had been the miracle of love, love that transcended death, love that waited 22 years for the perfect moment to act, love that sacrificed its own existence to save others. Emily Grace Blackstone had lived for 5 minutes in 2001, but her love would last forever. 6 months later, Richard stood at the altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral, his legs steady beneath him as he watched Sarah walk down the aisle in a simple white dress. They had decided to remarry on Emily's birthday, not the date of her death, but the date she would have been born if she had lived a full life. June 15th, the summer solstice, when the light lasted longest and hope felt possible. The congregation was small. Margaret Peterson, Sarah's husband David, who had graciously stepped aside with remarkable understanding, her children Jessie and Michael, and a handful of close friends who had witnessed their journey back to each other. Richard's sister Patricia sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her brother embrace a happiness she had thought was lost forever. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, "we are gathered here today to witness not just the union of two souls, but the healing of a family that love refused to let die." Richard had told Father Martinez the full story of Emily's return, expecting skepticism or concern for his mental health. Instead, the elderly priest had smiled and said, "Miracles are God's way of reminding us that love is stronger than death. Your daughter was an angel in the truest sense, a messenger of divine grace." As they exchanged vows, Richard felt a presence he had learned to recognize, the gentle warmth that meant Emily was near, watching over them one last time. He glanced toward the back of the cathedral and could have sworn he saw a flash of white dress, a glimpse of dark hair, a smile that transcended the boundary between worlds. "Do you, Richard Blackstone, take Sarah to be your wife, to love her in sickness and health, in sorrow and joy, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Richard said, his voice strong and clear. "And I promise to love not just Sarah, but the daughter we share, wherever she may be." Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy as she squeezed his hands. They had spent the past 6 months learning to be a family again, learning to honor Emily's memory without being imprisoned by grief. Richard had established the Emily Grace Foundation, providing support for families dealing with pregnancy loss. Sarah had left David amicably and moved back to New York, where she worked as a grief counselor specializing in infant and child loss. Together, they had purchased a small house in Westchester, not far from the cemetery where they had once buried their hopes for their daughter. The house had a garden where Sarah grew roses and a studio where Richard had taken up painting, something he had loved before the accident but abandoned during his years of bitterness. The most remarkable change, however, was in Richard himself. The man who had spent 15 years as a ruthless corporate shark had transformed into someone unrecognizable. He still ran his company, but now he did it with compassion and purpose. He had established programs for disabled employees, donated millions to spinal cord research, and personally mentored young entrepreneurs who reminded him of his former self. "You may kiss the bride," Father Martinez announced, and Richard did, feeling Emily's approval wash over them like benediction. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel, where Richard and Sarah had celebrated their first wedding 30 years earlier. As they danced their first dance, Richard on legs that still sometimes trembled but held him steady, Sarah whispered in his ear, "She's here, isn't she? I can feel her." "She's here," Richard confirmed, spinning Sarah slowly across the dance floor. "She'll always be here." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Richard found himself standing alone on the hotel's balcony, looking out over Central Park. The spring air was warm and sweet with the scent of blooming trees, and the city lights sparkled like earthbound stars. "Thank you," he said quietly to the night sky. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't end with death. Thank you for giving me back my legs, my life, and most importantly, my heart." A gentle breeze stirred the air around him, carrying the faint sound of childish laughter and the whisper of a voice he would never forget. "You're welcome, Daddy. Now go live the life I gave back to you." Richard smiled through his tears and walked back inside to join his wife, his future, and the family they would build together in memory of the daughter who had saved them both. 5 years later, Richard and Sarah stood in the maternity ward of Mount Sinai Hospital, looking down at their newborn granddaughter, Jessie's first child, born healthy and perfect after a difficult pregnancy. The baby had been born on October 15th, exactly 27 years after Emily's brief existence and 17 years after Richard's accident. "What are you going to name her?" Sarah asked her stepdaughter, who had grown to love and accept her biological mother's replacement with grace and understanding. Jessie looked up at Richard and Sarah with tears in her eyes. "We've been thinking about family names," she said. "David and I would like to call her Emily Grace, if that's all right with you. After the sister I never got to meet, but who somehow saved my stepfather's life." Richard's legs, now strong from years of walking and physical therapy, nearly gave out from the force of his emotions. Sarah took his hand and squeezed tight as they both stared down at the baby who bore their lost daughter's name. She would be honored, Sarah whispered. And so are we. As baby Emily Grace opened her eyes for the first time, Richard could have sworn he saw a flash of ancient wisdom in those newborn depths, as if their daughter had found yet another way to return to them, to ensure that love truly was stronger than death, and that some families are meant to find each other again and again, across time and space, and the mysterious boundaries between worlds. The miracle hadn't just been Richard's healing, or Emily's impossible return, or even the restoration of his marriage to Sarah. The miracle was the understanding that love creates its own reality, writes its own rules, and refuses to be limited by the boundaries of life and death. Richard Blackstone had spent 15 years learning about limitations, but his daughter had taught him about possibilities, and he would spend the rest of his life walking forward into the infinite potential of love that never dies. In the end, Emily Grace had kept her promise. She had made her father walk again, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually, into a future bright with hope and purpose and the kind of love that performs miracles every single day. And somewhere, in the space between heartbeats and the pause between breaths, their daughter smiled and finally peacefully went home.